Okay, so whilst I get fed up with the homogenisation of all older people over 65, I am going to start off with a few scary statistics though. That over 2 million, that's over 2 million of us will be aged over 65 just by 2041. So, yep, it's fair to say we are an ageing population. We have been for a while, and that trend is looking to continue. And of that, only 5%, well, not even 5% actually, of older people live in residential aged care. Yet when you talk about housing for older people, there's this automatic assumption that you're talking about nursing homes and retirement villages, when actually there's so much in between, and so few of us will ever end up in a nursing home, hopefully. Anyway, so these changing demographics, the ageing population, up to now, all the sort of research and policy around those issues have focused very much on the financial implication, the tsunami of ageing that's going to affect the healthcare system, and we're never going to be able to pay for healthcare for older people and all that kind of stuff. And that's worthy, yes, that's relevant. But what about housing? Far less attention is ever given to housing options for older people. Which is really a real shame, because your housing is a critical part of your life, and your housing connects you to your community, it connects you to your neighbours, to your family, to your friends, to your church, to your doctor. And so if you haven't got good housing that's affordable, secure and safe, then how are you going to live a good life as you get older? And so housing policy in practice here, as I said, has really lagged behind the sort of the financial implications and or other issues to do with ageing. It's just as if housing's an afterthought that, you know, well, everybody lives in a house, so we don't need to worry about that when it comes to older people. But this is a real concern because, I mean, older people aren't immune from housing affordability problems. They're not immune from poor quality housing. And we generally sort of assume that people will stay in their own home, so in their family home. Maybe some might choose to move into a retirement village if that's the lifestyle that they're looking for, and or some might end up in residential aged care. But as I said, that is a really small proportion. And the sad truth is that for older people who don't own their own homes, any sort of housing insecurity and stress is multiplied. And I don't like to say this to all the ladies in the room, but single women face particular risks in terms of housing in later life, and older single women are actually increasingly becoming the fastest growing cohort of homelessness. So, as I said, housing affordability is an issue for older people as well. More older people are falling out of home ownership. They can't afford to maintain their mortgages, and or they're paying off their mortgage later in life. You know, we all have this dream of when we retire, we own our own home and we're secure and we can just stay there and that's fine. But that's not the case. And so, particularly given the fact that our government aged care, well, the pension rather, is predicated on the fact that you own your own home. So if you own your own home, you can probably live on the pension. But if you don't, you can't. And homeowners spend a lot less on their housing. So a typical homeowner over 65 probably spends about 5% of their income on housing, whereas somebody that's in the private rental system, same age, paying for their housing through rent, will pay over 30% sometimes of their income on housing, which doesn't leave an awful lot for much else, really. So with all that in mind, where do you think you'll live in later life? Have you actually thought of what the options could be? Are you assuming you'll stay where you are? And can you stay where you are? Is your house suitable for you to move in or to live in later life? And so, as I say, these are kind of our standard options, if you like. But what if I told you there was another way? There are so many other options out there, but they're just not delivered either at all in Australia, or they're not delivered at scale and supported to be delivered at scale in Australia. So I had obviously the luck and the joy of doing a Churchill Fellowship last year, and I met people and I saw housing types that really do enable people to age well, if that's what they want to do in that environment, or enable them to move on to something different, that are grounded in completely different societal views and also sort of provided, as I said, at scale. And so I'm going to talk about 3 of them in particular today. So the first one is the teepee style houses up here. So that was actually in Japan. So I kind of probably a bit naively assumed when I visited a couple of Asian countries that familial piety would take over. And so most older people would be looked after by their children. And yes, that's the case to a certain degree. But I also discovered that there's a whole heap of other stuff that's going on. And people are happily sort of getting together, creating alternative living types. And I don't mean alternative in some 70s hippie commune kind of way necessarily. Just they've come together with an alternative model that brings together the community connection, like-minded people, and that it's a bit like the presentations this morning. It's that ground-up thing that you can make these things work. So as I say, this teepee style one on the slide there is in Tokyo, or just outside Tokyo. It's called Jika House, which means mother's house or mama's place or something like that. And it was actually dreamed up by 2 co-workers. They were social workers, 2 women, who just decided that they wanted to, basically, it's all that kind of there, but for the grace of God go I, but they wanted something better for themselves. They could see what was potentially available to them, and that didn't interest them at all in terms of their housing in later life. So they got together. One of them, her son was an architect, and he'd only just graduated, and the mother was really concerned that he wasn't actually going to get any work at all as an architect. So she and her friend commissioned him to build something for them. And so what was built was as I say, Jika House, which is a series of sort of teepee-style buildings for housing, and also one had a sort of a communal area where the 2 ladies would cook lunch every day. And anybody from the community could come, young, old, didn't matter. It was reasonably priced. And I can tell you, if I lived there, I'd be going every day if I could, because I was lucky enough to go to one of these lunches. And it was a 3-hour afternoon affair, full degustation, all these amazing little plates came out. But anyway, I digress. You see, the other interest of mine is food. But over that time, we got talking with some of the other people, and a lot of them, they were quite happy in their own homes, but they just came for the community connection. Other people were looking at, could they make this work for them, or could they in fact move in to here at some point? So, I mean, at the moment, there was only 1 unit, if you like, available to live in. But when I was having this lovely long lunch, talking to the ladies about what their plans were for the future, and they were saying that they wanted to have more accommodation, but that would be independent, but there's still that if you want to go to lunch, there's that communal kind of get-together of things. But again, it wasn't whilst the housing would be age segregated, the community stuff wasn't. So anybody could go to the lunch, all you had to do was book in and pay, essentially. And the building, I guess having an architect's son helps, but it was fabulous. The design of it was amazing, and it had the house that was there. I should have put a photo on the slide, but I couldn't get them all on. Had the most amazing bath that was a big spiral sort of going down. So you walked, so anybody, if you had mobility issues as you got older, you could just slowly walk down into this amazing bath and sit at the bottom, and then just slowly, it was like a big ammonite or whatever those fossils are called. But anyway, so that was fantastic, and not what I expected to see. I mean, well, obviously I did because I booked to go there, but essentially not what I thought I was going to see in Asia. So that was Asia. Well, one example thereof. The second place I'm going to talk about is Vienna. And this is more of a societal, cultural kind of finding, I suppose, as much as a housing finding. So in Vienna, which are the 2 bottom, sort of the 2 cream middle bottom ones, people from all walks of life pepper-potted throughout live in social housing, and there is no stigma, there's no nothing. It's just perfectly acceptable that's what you might do. It's long-term secure tenancies, so you can live there for life. There are beautiful old heritage ones like those on the screen, but also they're unlike here, they're still adding to their social housing, so they're building more purpose-built blocks in other parts of Vienna, and they are, I think their biggest challenge is renovating some of these older ones, but they've got a programme to do that too. And young and old, low to middle income, obviously not high income, but when I was there, the upper limit of a monthly income equated to dollars was something like $5,400 a month, and you could live in Solna. And that's a fair wage. And apparently not only 75% of Viennese don't earn that amount. So it was kind of, that's a fairly generous thing for social housing. But as I say, the beauty of it was long-term tenancies, not ghettoed sort of social housing, beautiful and well-located properties. I would gladly have lived in... So the apartments that were pepper potted throughout that bottom middle, they were just gorgeous, high ceilings, everything that you could possibly want to live for. And I think if I had a secure tenancy and could stay there for life, I would happily stay there for life. And they also had a programme that sort of would modify if you needed any modifications or would move you. So some of the blocks only had stairs. So if you needed to be moved, that's fine. They had a programme in place to do that. And this culture of social housing available to everyone actually is long-standing in Vienna. It goes back to the Red Vienna period, which was the early 20th centuries, where it was a majority socialist government, and one of their key tenets of anything was providing quality, affordable housing for city residents. And so Vienna remains committed to that today, which is fabulous. And as I say, as it's so common an option and so readily available, I guess, to most Viennese, there really is no stigma. It's not viewed as welfare. It's just a part of life. That's just how you live. So, unless you happen to tell your neighbours that what your rent is, nobody would know. Nobody would know. And so finally to co-housing, which you can see on the top right and up top middle. As we saw from the first two presentations, the Danes have got it licked, So co-housing is, models can differ with co-housing, but generally they're self-managing groups of people that have come together to live together. So they have their own private space, so their own private home, which is self-contained, and then they share communal facilities. So that might be craft rooms, they might share a communal laundry, spaces like gardens, they might have community gardens or just have their own little bit in a garden. And then some of them also share activities such as meals or craft clubs or something like that. And so the whole intent is to foster social interaction and support. And kind of in later years as well, the intent has kind of grown to be about reducing impact on climate. So if you have a share car rather than everyone having their own car, and those kind of things. As I said, the model isn't new, and there are actually very limited examples in Australia, but in the US and Denmark, where I saw, and Denmark actually is the birthplace of co-housing, so I saw several models in the US and in Denmark, and that were run and had been built in a range of different ways, which I think is the trick, and that's a reason why that's kind of one of the things why there's no reason we can't do that here in Australia. It's not such a culturally different thing. So I was lucky enough to go to 3 co-housing communities while I was away. I went to 1 in Denmark and I went to 2 in the States. They took really quite different forms, had been established at different times, were funded in different ways, were managed in different ways, and had different communities living within them. So the apartment block was the newest one that I visited. That was the Olakola community in Copenhagen. And this community was 150% driven by one woman, essentially, who got together. I mean, it was a collective of people, but this one woman was amazing. She was determined that they were going to stay in the suburb of Norrborough, which is where that is, and that's where all of her and her friends lived. The city, they were lobbying the city council, they were lobbying banks, they were lobbying MPs, they were lobbying everyone they could think of. And a handful of, I guess, city councillors had kind of tried to palm them off a number of times with it. Oh, you can have a block of land over there, do what you want with it. And they were like, no, that's, you know, way out of Copenhagen. Why the hell do we want to go there? The whole point is we want to stay here. So they just absolutely dug their heels in and stuck to their guns. And so with all of that work that they did, and then they got architects involved, they got banks involved, they got everyone that they could think of involved. And finally, it hit the ground running, and basically they managed to get it to the design they wanted, the style they wanted, the sustainability credentials that they wanted. And it was funded partly by the residents, but mostly by community housing grants and cheap bank loans. Remember that, cheap bank loans. Even though it was a lengthy process, and even though they moved in during COVID, during 2020, which was probably not ideal for a cohesive community, you know, they kind of couldn't actually get together and do anything together. However, that notwithstanding, they now have a really strong community. There's 33 apartments. There are several groups that, I mean, they're not compulsory. They're not, you know, it's not kind of like you sign up to this. I mean, there are certain things that you have to want to be a part of, but you don't have to be a part of every single group. So, I mean, there was a gardening group, there was a maintenance group, there was a kitchen group, which was very important, going back to my other love in life, because the kitchen group actually, so they take it in turns on a weekly basis, and they have 5 nights a week, they have a communal dinner for anybody that wants to go. And I was invited to attend one of them, and it was fabulous. It was lovely. You don't have to go, and also if you want to be a part of it, but you know you're going to be late or something like that, they'll pop your dinner in a plastic container and put it in the fridge with your name on, so you just come home from work and there it is, all ready to go. And as I say, it really did help kind of foster the interaction between the community, but not in each other's pockets kind of a way. And in America, I visited 2 co-housing communities, one in Portland, which is the top middle, and then another one in Boulder, Colorado. Now, like the Danish community, both of them were driven by residents, but in both of the American ones, the residents had sufficient resources to fund themselves. So basically, they had assets that they could offload and buy into this whole process. And they were slightly smaller, both of them, particularly the one in Boulder, which was only 16 units. It was a mixture of houses and apartments. And like the Olakola community, there were various groups that you could be part of if you wanted to. And guess what? I had a dinner with the dinner group. Would have been rude not to. And the Silver Sage one in Boulder, which I haven't got a photo of, that was interesting because that was the oldest one, if you like. So that one was 16 years old. And I think the beauty of having a dinner with them was to really get to the nitty-gritty of what could be the problems as you go along. Because I think the other 2 were still very young and everything was wonderful, you know, they were loving it. Whereas the Silver Sage community in Boulder, they were starting to see where some of the wrinkles might appear. So, for example, you know, one of your neighbours is starting to get a bit more infirm, and, you know, for the last 16 years, if they've had a cold or they had a knee operation or something, you were happy to give them care as a neighbour, so you maybe do their shopping for them or that kind of bits and pieces. But where do you draw the line then between, oh, actually, she needs help showering and I'm really not comfortable to do that? So they had actually, as a result of these kind of issues starting to appear, they had set up another group, and they'd also brought in sort of representation from some of the in-home care providers or social housing or social care providers in the area. And they said, you know, we wish we'd done this before, but this is a real learning for us. And then the other thing that was interesting, that they were just going through the process of the first original resident moving out. And how do they get somebody new into this very close community of 16 people or 16 members? And so I said to them, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to interview them all? And she said, well, we don't know. We haven't come to a conclusion yet about whether it's a bit intimidating to have all of the rest of the residents and the potential newcomers sitting opposite the table going, now, what are your thoughts on this? And politically, what do you think about that? And are you religious? And are you... And she said, which is stupid, because none of that matters, really. But, you know, so it was interesting to see how they were starting to think about those issues and how they might possibly deal with them. So I guess the upshot, then, of my travels is that there are innovative models out there that are provided at scale, that are sustainable both financially and climatically, or, you know, in terms of the climate, and that are grounded in a range of societal views. And I guess societal views that we shouldn't necessarily, or I shouldn't necessarily have assumed. So my views about Asian familial piety, for example. And I suppose I wasn't expecting a Central European country that's pretty wealthy to have a very strong social housing and perfectly acceptable normal social housing sort of arrangement, so to speak. So how do we improve? What can we do here in Australia? And I think, like anything, we've just got to challenge the norm. If we can tackle the small and insignificant issues of cultural and societal views, maybe I'll leave world peace for somebody a bit later, we probably can make them work in Australia. Now, we've got to get over a few hurdles. We are historically a home-owning nation. Culturally, we see renting as a transition stage. It's what you do when you're young before you move into the house that you've bought. And as a result of which, and I'm sure David will also mention this, we've got really crappy tenancy regulations in Australia, essentially. They differ across the states and territories, but essentially, until the last few years, where we're starting to talk about it now, they're short-term, you can be evicted at the drop of a hat. A lot of them are in terrible condition, you know, they're not healthy and safe to be living in. So we really need to do some action on that and change that culture that renting is actually a perfectly acceptable thing to do for your entire life, so long as you have a secure tenancy that, in a home that you can make your own, and that is safe and affordable. And so we also kind of need to, say just a small ask, stop looking down on social housing and welfare. We've all kind of historically, that's for the dole bludgers, that's for the, you know, I mean, in fact, even there are quotes from our politicians that essentially, I'm paraphrasing, are saying, well, you know, you're clearly a bad mother if you're not working, or you know, it's just something that we've really got to move on from. And I mean, the federal government has started having some of those discussions, which are great. So the Albanese government has just closed a consultation on a national housing and homelessness plan. And several states and territories have started looking at their tenancy regulations and other kind of affordable housing measures. And all of those are great, and I'm not taking away from that. But older people need to have a say in some of this as well. Housing problems in Australia aren't just about first-time buyers or tax breaks for landlords. You know, there is a huge system, and we need to recognise that. And of course, as other wicked policy problems, every level of government's got their finger in the pie, and every level of government will happily point to the other one if it suits them. And as I say, remember that statistic that I gave you earlier, that less than 5% of older people live in residential care. So that's 95% of us that deserve really good housing as we get older that helps us to age well and stay in the community that we want to. And so we need equity of access, and that isn't constrained by age, by income, by health status or by tenure. Why don't, for example, for those people that do want to live in a retirement village, if you want to rent in a retirement village, good luck to you, essentially. There are a handful of retirement village providers that have rental, but virtually all of them are on a buy-in basis. So if you have no capital asset to sell or you have no funding behind you, you're never going to live in a retirement village. So that is just something that could change so easily in terms of the properties are there, why can't some of them be, made into rental accommodation? And why do we still consistently see the same sort of cookie cutter built new homes, your 3-bed family nuclear home kind of thing? That's not what everybody wants at any age, And the key thing, as I said, remember the cheap bank loans statement that I made about Denmark. We need banks and other funders to develop and offer as standard more flexible forms of funding here. So if you were a collective of people now in Australia that wanted to go to a bank and get a mortgage on a co-housing property or a co-housing development, you wouldn't get one because such things don't exist. And we need to change that thinking about it doesn't have to be your bog standard 30-year mortgage that's, that you start when you're 25 and you've paid off by the time you're 55. Because that's changing. People are changing. Everybody has a slightly different need. So I think flexible funding, both for corporates but especially for individuals or collectives of individuals, is needed, really. And in anything that we do, we need to future-proof and make the housing sustainable. And by that I mean financially, able to be delivered at scale, that suits older people, that gets the blessing of the construction and design industries too, and also that need to be either modifiable or can work in both metro and regional areas. Because, we are seeing, thanks to COVID as well, more and more people moving out of major cities. So it might be all very well that you've got these whiz-bang housing developments in the city, but if you live outside of those, you need decent housing there too. And of course, we have to consider our changing climate. As I mentioned, most private rental properties are not in great condition. Private rentals won't have solar panels, they won't have access to cheaper electricity unless we get some nice local community system getting up and running. And so we need to think that, because we are getting into a hotter and drier climate, and extreme events. So there are a range of things that could bring this all together. There could be a national housing policy, so maybe that is led by something akin to a national cabinet that was developed during COVID, that has the involvement of all the states and territories and not being precious, as in them not being precious, and the service providers and a lot of the peak bodies, because we do need a genuine agenda for change and innovation. And yes, policy problems are wicked problems, we know that, but we just need to also recognise that, as I said, the housing system is huge. It is not just about one part or one group of people. It's a massive thing. We all want to live in safe and secure housing, so there should be a number of models that help us do that. And so, in closing, I'd obviously first like to thank the Churchill Trust for the opportunity to do this. And I hope that this presentation has made you reflect upon where you'll live when you get older, that you'll consider seeking out innovative models of housing that suit you, and that you don't simply reconcile yourself to the status quo. Thank you.